Wait, yeah. Just start at the tip, at that part, the top.
The very part?
Yeah, the top.
Okay. Detective Bernard Sims parked his broken-down white Mercedes in back of the old gardener's truck. He reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a piece of paper. After locking the doors of his car, the detective slipped his car keys into his blazer pocket. Detective Sims walked slowly past the gardener's house and then almost tripped over Mr. Burns' cabbage patch. He was wearing a cheap-looking suit that appeared as if it hadn't been pressed in months. In his upper left-hand corner pocket, he was carrying a search warrant. When he reached the front door, he rang the bell. Mrs. Wentz answered the door. "How do you do, ma'am? I'm Detective Sims of the Central North Precinct. Is Mrs. Grace at home?" asked the detective. "Yes, just a minute," Mrs. Wentz replied. Judith was in the kitchen trying to bake a cake. When Mrs. Wentz told her that the detective was at the front door, Judith dropped one of the cake pans, spilling batter onto the floor. "Oh, he is?" Judith uttered hesitantly. After putting the baking pans aside, Judith walked across the living room rug to the front door. "What a surprise to see you again, Detective," said Judith as she stood at the front door with cake batter on her hands. Detective Sims reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "This is a search warrant, Mrs. Grace," said the detective. "I'll just be taking a look around the premises for a short period of time." "Well, since you're going to be here for a while, can I get you a cup of coffee?" said Judith. "Please, cream and sugar," said the detective. "I suppose the first place that I would like to look would be your basement, Mrs. Grace," said the detective as he slipped the search warrant into his blazer pocket. "It's the first door on the left down the hall," said Judith. As Detective Sims opened the door to the basement and began to descend the stairs, Judith walked into the kitchen. She turned on the hot water faucet and filled the coffee pot. The linoleum on the floor in the basement was slightly rotted away and cracked as the detective walked on it. Judith opened the cupboard and brought down 2 cups and 2 saucers. The dust and cobwebs surrounding the pipes in the basement looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. I like this, how you say one sentence about what she's doing and one sentence about what he's doing. I like that. A mouse ran along a ledge under a dirty window near a fuse box. There was a framed photograph of a man in a military uniform on the wall by the fuse box. As a whistle from the coffee pot sounded, Judith placed the cups and saucers onto a tray. She poured the coffee and turned off the oven, which she had intended for her cake. As Detective Sims began to ascend the stairs from the basement, Judith reached for a green pill bottle standing on the kitchen windowsill. "That certainly is one of the darkest basements I've been in a while," said the detective as Judith watched 3 pellets from the pill bottle dissolve in the coffee cup closest to the sugar bowl. "I know. We've been meaning to clean it out for a while, but we just haven't had the time," said Judith. Mrs. Wentz poured a bowl of milk for Elgin, who'd been crying at the back door. The detective walked into the hallway as Judith came out from the kitchen with a tray in her arms. "Here, Detective, have a seat. Cream and sugar, right?" said Judith. "Just what I need," said Detective Bernard Sims. "On my schedule, I barely have time for a glass of water," he said. As they both sat on the sofa, the clock began to ring 2. Elgin walked under the dining room table. "You detectives, you should take better care of yourselves. Always running, never getting your second wind," said Judith as she picked up Elgin and began to pet him. "It's just part of the job, Mrs. Grace. We try not to think about it," said Detective Sims as he lifted his coffee cup to his mouth. "Mrs. Grace, is your husband at home?" asked Detective Sims after he had taken a sip of his coffee. "Mr. Grace, God bless his soul, passed away many years ago," said Judith. "He was a colonel in World War II. He used to write all the time, but one day a letter came from the army instead of John, saying that he was missing in combat," said Judith. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Grace." As the detective started to lift the lid of the sugar bowl, his right hand began to shake. "It's very hot in here," said Detective Sims, as he began to rub his eyes. Want me to continue? Well, in this kind of weather, we try to move as slowly as possible without working up a sweat, said Judith. Mrs. Grace, would you mind helping me out to my car? I have to get my medicine, said Detective Sims in a weak voice as he dropped his pad and paper on the living room rug. Certainly, Detective Sims, said Judith as she reached